All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going deep, really deep, into the philosophical world of Thomas Jefferson. Now, we all know him as a statesman, the Declaration of Independence, president, all that. But what we're going to uncover today is the philosophical system under the surface that really shaped his actions and, the nation he helped create.
Yeah.
Our main source for this deep dive are excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Thomas Jefferson. It's super in-depth, and we'll, really try to get at the core of his philosophical thinking.
Yeah, and for our listeners who like to, acquire knowledge efficiently and thoroughly, this is going to be great. It's kind of like a cheat sheet to understanding a pretty complex thinker. We're going to extract the core philosophical concepts that really drove him without having to, read through all of his writings.
Right, exactly.
We're on a mission here to uncover some surprising and informative insights that might challenge, how you currently think about Thomas Jefferson.
Right. So first off, it's interesting that Jefferson never actually, sat down and wrote a full-blown philosophical treatise.
Yeah.
So does that mean his philosophy was more, practical than theoretical? Or were his ideas just kind of baked into all of his actions? I mean, where do his philosophical leanings even come from in the first place? His life, his influences, all that must have had a huge impact.
Right, definitely. And it's interesting because even early on, you can kind of see hints of the man he would become. Like, just think about, the almost stoic way he recorded his mother's death in his account book.
Mm.
Just, a brief entry followed by weeks of migraines. It really tells you something.
Right.
And it's in such stark contrast to, how profoundly his father's death impacted him.
Yeah.
I mean, he was only 14 when his father died, and he basically had to, guide himself. He even wrote later in life that he was astonished, genuinely surprised that he didn't go astray given the lack of, direction he had.
Yeah, it's like he had to grow up fast.
Yeah. So that early independence seems super key to his development.
Yeah, losing his dad like that. I mean, it basically just threw him into this, sink or swim situation intellectually.
Yeah.
But, what's fascinating to me is that early independence and self-reliance, it seemed to, fuel his intellectual curiosity even more. He wasn't just passively learning things. He was out there actively searching for knowledge.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, his formal schooling, starting with a clergyman who had pretty limited classical knowledge, and then, moving on to a more accomplished scholar, Reverend James Morey, that laid the groundwork.
Sure.
But it was really his time at William and Mary College, his relationships with Professor William Small and lawyer George Wythe, that really set him on his intellectual path.
Yeah. I mean, those were some serious mentors.
They were. He said that Small really, expanded his horizons when it came to science and how everything kind of connected together.
Yeah.
And then Wythe, of course, was his mentor in law throughout his life.
Right. And we're not just talking about, basic legal stuff. Our source makes it clear that Jefferson believed a lawyer should be, and I'm quoting here, a human encyclopedia of useful knowledge.
Wow.
I mean, he thought they should be delving into physical sciences, morality, religion, natural law, politics, history. I mean, everything.
Everything.
Can you imagine, that level of rigorous, self-directed education, after he left William and Mary, all before he even started practicing law?
Yeah.
It's mind-boggling.
It is. It really paints this picture of someone who was driven to understand the world around him.
Yeah, a real hunger for knowledge.
Definitely. And even in his early days as a lawyer, you see glimmers of his developing philosophy. He took on all these pro bono cases for enslaved people.
Oh, yeah.
And there was this one case, Howell v. Netherland, where he actually argued that, quote, under the law of nature, all men are born free. Right. And this is years before the Declaration of Independence. What's important here is, this early engagement with the concept of natural rights.
Yeah.
While he's representing enslaved people. It suggests that these ideas were really taking root, long before he wrote his, major political works.
Yeah, so he's already thinking about these ideas, these big questions about natural rights, while he's actually arguing for the freedom of enslaved people in court.
Yeah.
It's almost like, looking back, his shift from law to politics seems inevitable. Maybe he realized his writing, his gift for communication, was just better suited for a bigger stage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And let's not forget his personal libraries. I mean, the guy amassed thousands of books, even after a fire destroyed his first collection. covering philosophy, history, religion. It wasn't just about collecting books. It was about like immersing himself in the world of ideas,
Okay.
both his time and before.
Right. Yeah. He's surrounding himself with like the greatest minds in history. Okay. So we've got this foundation laid, right? We've got this self-taught polymath immersed in like all the key intellectual debates of his day. So now let's dive into his views on the big stuff, deity, nature, society. This is where it gets really interesting. So Jefferson, kind of like a lot of thinkers he admired, Newton, Hume, Locke, he was an empiricist and a materialist. Now, just so we're all on the same page, an empiricist is someone who believes that, like, our knowledge comes primarily from our senses, from observing the world around us.
Right.
And a materialist is someone who believes that everything, including our minds, is ultimately made of matter.
Exactly. He really believed that our senses and our ability to reason based on what we sense, that those were the primary ways we could understand the world. And he had this great quote, "I feel, therefore I exist. I feel bodies which are not myself. There are other existences then. I call them matter."
Okay, so matter is like the fundamental building block of everything.
Yeah. So the key idea is that even something like, the mind, which seems so separate from the physical world, wasn't some kind of, otherworldly entity for Jefferson. It was rooted in the material world.
Right, so it's not like some separate soul or spirit floating around.
Exactly. He didn't see things like even mind and God as immaterial. They were, for him, just, particular organizations of matter.
Okay, so everything comes down to matter, even consciousness.
Yeah, but here's where it gets even more interesting. He had this sort of pragmatic approach to atomism. He recognized that, like, if we break things down too much, if we go all the way down to atoms, the mind kind of loses its grasp,
Okay.
So while he believed that the things we observe, the particulars, were like concretizations of atoms, he kind of viewed atoms almost as useful, stopping points in our analysis. But kind of arbitrary, too.
Trying to wrap my head around that.
Think of it like a painting, right? You can break a painting down into, like, its individual brushstrokes, but at a certain point, you lose sight of the beauty, the meaning of the whole picture.
Oh, I see. That's a great analogy. So it wasn't like some deep metaphysical commitment to, like, atomism in the way, say, the Epicureans thought about it.
Exactly. And kind of connected to this is his view of nature, which was nominalist, heavily influenced by John Locke. He believed that nature produces individuals, unique things.
Yeah.
But things like classes, orders, genera, species, those are all human-made categories, ways for us, with our limited memories, to kind of organize this vast, infinitude of units that nature actually produces. He even said, no two animals are exactly alike. No two plants, nor even two leaves or blades of grass. No two crystallizations.
So nature is all about the individual, the unique. It's us who lump things together into categories.
Right, for convenience, for our own understanding.
So these categories we create, they're really just like mental shortcuts to help us make sense of the world. Okay. So now when we zoom out and think about the whole cosmos, Jefferson had this like stoic view. He believed in a designing deity.
Yeah. He even wrote to Adams about how it was impossible to not see design, consummate skill, and indefinite power in every atom of its composition.
Wow.
He talks about a fabricator of all things, from matter in motion, an ultimate cause. So, clearly he believed in a creator. But this isn't necessarily the kind of God who's constantly, fiddling with the universe.
So how does that square with his, his emphasis on science?
Right. That's where the idea of divine superintendence comes in. So Jefferson definitely believed in a deity, the fabricator, as the, initial cause.
Yeah.
But he seemed to lean more toward the idea that the cosmos is self-regulating rather than, like, constantly needing supernatural intervention. He was influenced by thinkers like Bolingbroke, who thought that, a deity with consummate skill would have set things up right from the start so they wouldn't need constant tinkering.
Right. So God creates this perfect system and then lets it run.
Exactly. And this is different from, like, the more traditional deistic view,
right,
where God creates and then basically just steps back and watches.
Yeah.
Jefferson's God seems to have created a universe that can, like, restore and renew itself. Think about, like, stars dying and new ones being born, or species going extinct and new ones emerging. It's this grand self-regulating system.
Okay, so the universe has its own kind of built-in mechanism for change and renewal.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so moving on from the cosmos to, morality, specifically building on his ideas about personal religious freedom, let's look at how Jefferson thought about, the figure of Jesus himself.
Right. And here's where Jefferson's own beliefs about religion become really important. And it's pretty nuanced. He was a huge advocate for the pursuit of happiness and religious freedom.
Yeah.
He really saw religion as something personal, between a person and their God. And this naturally led him to, really champion the separation of church and state, that whole wall of separation idea.
Absolutely. And for him, true morality wasn't about following specific religious dogmas, but more about what he called the mild and simple principles of the Christian philosophy. And he thought these principles were common to all religions that, had good intentions. He saw the moral teachings of religion as universal, instructing us on how to live a good life in society. Dogmas, on the other hand, he saw as divisive and often, serving the interests of those who preached them.
Okay, so he's drawing a distinction between the moral core of religion and the more specific doctrines that, can separate people.
Right.
And here's where it gets really fascinating. He had this really high regard for Jesus as a moral reformer.
He did. He called Jesus the greatest of all the religious reformers and said his teachings formed the, greatest moral system. He focused on things like, the existence of one God and afterlife, loving God and your neighbor.
Yeah. But then we run into this apparent paradox, this idea of moral atheism that comes from a letter he wrote to Thomas Law. He asks this question, whence arises the morality of the atheist?
Right.
And this has led some scholars to think that Jefferson believed that morality could exist totally separate from God.
Yeah, it sparked a lot of debate. Some argue that, his acknowledging that atheists can be moral points to his belief that you don't need a divine foundation for morality. They point to his emphasis on this innate moral sense we've been talking about.
Right.
But then other interpretations, like the one presented in our source, suggest that maybe Jefferson was just saying that atheists can behave morally, their actions can be virtuous. But for him, true morality, at least for someone who believes in God, has to involve this sense of duty to God, a recognition of God's role in the moral order. Because, it's one thing to just act in accordance with moral principles.
Yeah.
It's another to do it with this understanding that you have a divine obligation.
So it's the difference between just doing the right thing and doing the right thing because you believe it's what God wants.
Yeah, exactly. And it's clear that Jefferson had this, very selective way of reading the Bible.
Oh, yeah. His harmonies of the Gospels are a perfect example. I mean, he literally cut out passages he thought were inconsistent with reason and natural law.
Like the virgin birth, miracles, resurrection, that kind of
all the supernatural stuff. He was really focused on the moral teachings of Jesus.
Yeah.
Seeing him more as a human moral example than, the divine savior.
Right. And that selective approach really shows how committed he was to reason and empirical observation, even when he was dealing with the religious texts. And when you look at his views on the afterlife, it seems pretty likely that he was skeptical.
Really?
Yeah, his commitment to materialism, plus, things he wrote in personal letters, like even mentioning eternal separation when his wife was on her deathbed, it all points to him not really believing in an afterlife. Some people argue that he did believe, based on, his occasional mentions of future rewards and punishments as motivation for good behavior.
Right.
But, the evidence seems to suggest that he was more skeptical than not.
Okay, so he might not have believed in an afterlife, but he still saw Jesus as this, moral role model.
Yeah, exactly. And finally, his embrace of Unitarianism wasn't so much about him, joining a specific sect. It was more about, a way of approaching religion that emphasized, the oneness of God, simplicity, not being tied to a specific sect, and aligning your faith with your own moral sense.
So it was more about a way of thinking about religion than, strict adherence to a specific set of doctrines.
Exactly.
Okay, which leads us perfectly to this super crucial concept of the moral sense in Jefferson's philosophy.
Yeah.
He was a firm believer in this innate, instinctual moral sense, almost like a sixth sense that we're all given by God. And he was really influenced by the Scottish empiricists on this, folks like Hutcheson and Hume.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
He even compared this moral sense to our physical senses, like hearing or sight.
Yeah, that comparison is really key. Just like we instinctively know when something is too loud or too bright,
Yeah.
Jefferson thought we have this internal moral faculty that tells us what's right and wrong without us having to, consciously reason it out. He even wrote to his daughter Martha and told her to, consider things beforehand and I'm quoting here, to feel something within you which will tell you it is wrong.
So he's saying morality isn't something we have to figure out through logic, but something we inherently feel.
Right.
That's fascinating.
And he told his nephew, Peter Carr, that if morality required us to use science to figure it out, then God would have been a pitiful bungler when he created us. He straight up says that reason isn't involved in making moral judgments.
Wow, so reason takes a back seat to this inner feeling. So the big takeaway here is that Jefferson believed morality wasn't a product of reason, but this inherent instinct we're all born with. It makes me wonder how he'd apply that to the complex ethical dilemmas that we grapple with today.
It does, right. And this moral sense, it's innate, but it's not something everyone has to the same degree, or maybe even at all. He famously used Napoleon as an example of someone who just, didn't seem to have it.
Right.
But even for those who do have this moral sense, reason still had a limited role. It could, encourage moral action, reinforce it, help us teach moral principles to kids, consider different cultures, recognize moral progress over time, clarify rights, form general rules, and maybe even encourage moral improvement through selective breeding, which of course is a pretty problematic idea by today's standards. But the core moral judgments themselves, those came from this innate sense.
So reason's more like a tool to help us refine our moral sense, not the source of morality itself.
Exactly. And what's important is his belief in moral progress. He, like many Enlightenment thinkers, believed that humanity was gradually becoming more moral over time, even with occasional setbacks. He even saw America as playing a leading role in this progress, showing Europe a better way by embracing liberty and respecting human rights. And this progress for him was all about moving towards those ideals of love for God and humanity, which he saw as best represented in the teachings of Jesus.
Okay, so let's switch gears a bit and dig into Jefferson's political philosophy, which is probably what he's most famous for.
Right.
How did he define republicanism?
Well, that's key, right? In his first inaugural address, he laid out these 15 essential principles of our government, which you could think of as his early attempt to define what a republic should be.
Okay.
This list included things like, equal justice, peace and commerce with all nations, federal support for state governments, election by the people, majority rule, a well-disciplined militia under civilian control, light taxation, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, it's a pretty solid list. It sounds like he really wanted a clear set of principles to guide the nation.
He did. And then 15 years later, he came back to these ideas in a bunch of letters, offering some different perspectives.
Yeah.
He listed these 9 moral principles that he thought were at the foundation of Republican government, emphasizing things like, innate morality, the fact that right is separate from force, the natural basis of property rights, the right to use your abilities in harmless ways. Justice is the fundamental law, the dangers of the majority becoming tyrannical, and, most importantly, the direct or representative action of citizens as the essence of a republic.
Yeah.
And he even gave this precise and definite idea to John Taylor: a government by its citizens en masse, acting directly and personally according to rules established by the majority.
So the citizens are really at the heart of his vision of a republic.
Absolutely. And then there's his mother principle, as he called it. In a letter to Samuel Kercheval, he wrote, and I'm quoting here, that governments are republican only in proportion as they embody the will of their people and execute it.
So the government should truly reflect the will of the people.
Exactly. He envisioned a government where citizens had a real voice, either directly, when possible, or through representatives they choose and can hold accountable. So how would you, sum up his core vision of a republic?
I think looking at all this, we can see that Jefferson's ideal republic would have ample opportunity for political participation, representatives chosen and recallable by the citizens, majority rule with, of course, protections for equal rights, and a government that operates according to rules that can be changed periodically.
Right. And it's really important to note that for Jefferson, this wasn't some kind of rigid system. It was meant to be progressive, even scientific.
Progressive? How so?
Well, he thought that constitutions, like laws, should be revised regularly, roughly every 19 years. Yeah. His calculation of a generation, by the way, to keep up with, how the human mind progresses and advances in science.
So it's not just set in stone. It's meant to evolve over time.
Yeah. So it's more like a framework for government by the people that constantly adapts to their, informed will, rather than a fixed blueprint.
I see. This idea of an informed citizenry brings us to his concept of the natural aristoi, which is pretty interesting. Can you explain what he meant by that?
Sure. He believed that there's this natural aristocracy among men that's based on virtue and talent, and it's different from the artificial aristocracy that's based on, wealth and birth.
Right. So it's not about who your parents were, but about your own abilities and character.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he argued that for a republic to really thrive, it needs to allow this natural aristocracy to rise to leadership positions, not through, privilege or connections, but through education and a free press, which would allow citizens to tell the difference between the real deal and the pseudo-aristoi.
So he wasn't against the idea of leaders, but he wanted them to be chosen based on merit, not privilege.
Precisely. And he saw a well-educated populace and a free flow of information as essential for this selection process. If citizens are informed, they're much more likely to elect the truly good and wise to govern.
Right. So education and a free press are key for a functioning republic.
Yeah. It's a direct challenge to those traditional hierarchical systems that are based on inherited privilege.
And then there's this principle of usufruct. The earth belongs in usufruct to the living, which is another fascinating idea with huge implications.
Yeah, for sure. So what that means is that Jefferson believed each generation should be pretty independent from the one before. This meant that, one generation shouldn't be able to rack up debts that burden future generations. And it also informed his idea of periodically renewing constitutions. He thought that constitutions, just like laws, should expire naturally after about 19 years, so each generation could create a government that, really reflects their needs and the advancements they've made.
So each generation gets a fresh start, free from the burdens and constraints of the past.
Exactly. It was a pretty radical idea, and as our source mentions, James Madison had some serious objections to it. Jefferson never really formally addressed those objections, but he also never gave up on the principle of generational sovereignty. It really shows his dedication to progress and his, wariness of the past having too much influence over the present.
So it's all about moving forward, not being stuck in the ways of the past.
Okay, so the last piece of Jefferson's political philosophy that we need to cover is his philosophy of revolution. He famously wrote in the Declaration of Independence about the right of the people to alter or abolish a government that becomes destructive of their rights.
Right.
But he wasn't advocating for constant upheaval and chaos.
No. He was very clear that revolutions shouldn't happen for light and transient causes. They should only happen when there's a long history of abuses that clearly show the government is becoming despotic. He even saw a certain amount of, violence and unrest as a necessary consequence of liberty. It's like a reminder to those in power that the government exists to serve the people.
Right, like a check on government power. And he made a distinction between rebellion and revolution.
He did. For Jefferson, rebellions were more localized, often, quick responses to very specific grievances.
Yeah.
But revolutions were larger, longer lasting, and aimed at completely overthrowing a fundamentally abusive government. So a rebellion is like a local protest, and a revolution is like a complete system overhaul.
Exactly. He understood that revolutions are these generational processes. The first generation might start it and keep it going, but it takes later generations to really settle things down and establish a stable, free government. And because revolution is so costly in terms of human life, he thought it should only be undertaken in extreme cases of persistent despotism.
So revolution is a last resort, not something to be taken lightly.
Definitely.
Okay, so a key part of Jefferson's vision of a thriving republic was his philosophy of education, which was deeply connected to his political ideals.
It was.
He believed that for a government to be truly of and for the people, you needed an educated citizenry who could participate fully and make informed decisions. So what were the main influences on his thinking about education?
Well, his views on education were shaped by a lot of different thinkers, especially those for the French Enlightenment, who really emphasized egalitarian, secular, and philosophically grounded education. He actually proposed a whole system of education for Virginia through a series of bills. Bill 79, which was titled For the More General Diffusion of Knowledge, was probably the most important one. It proposed this system of ward schools for basic literacy and math, as well as district schools for more advanced learning. He also wanted to reform William and Mary College, that was Bill 80, and establish a public library, that was Bill 81. And all of this was supposed to operate within a framework of religious freedom, which was outlined in Bill 82.
So a pretty comprehensive plan for education reform. And his core belief was clear liberty could only be safe if people were educated.
Yeah, he famously said, wherever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government. But he wasn't naively optimistic about it.
Right.
He knew that for a republic to work, Citizens needed at least a basic education.
And it wasn't just about, individual citizens being able to vote intelligently.
No, it was bigger than that.
Yeah.
He saw education as crucial for human flourishing, being able to participate in politics and moral progress. He even outlined 6 key features of his ideal education system. It should be available to everyone, supported by taxes, secular, locally controlled, allow for free inquiry at the higher levels, and make it possible for the most talented students to advance at public expense.
So a pretty progressive vision of education, and it sounds like he had a very specific view of knowledge itself.
He did. He had this Baconian view where knowledge is power, safety, and happiness. He believed that education could, unlock human potential that's just waiting to be tapped into and help us become more moral.
Okay, so education wasn't just about filling your head with facts. It was about empowering individuals and making society better as a whole.
Exactly. And for Jefferson, moral learning wasn't about intellectual understanding, but about learning to trust that innate moral sense we talked about earlier and learning from history and from, moral exemplars. He believed that a truly useful education would produce capable citizens and leaders who would contribute to the well-being of both individuals and society.
So a virtuous cycle where education leads to better citizens, which leads to a better society, which then further promotes education.
Right. And ultimately, for Jefferson, education was this lifelong process that aimed to create people who were socially and politically engaged, free, self-sufficient, and happy.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into Thomas Jefferson's philosophical world, it's clear that he was a thinker of incredible breadth and depth, grappling with fundamental questions about metaphysics, morality, politics, and education. And even though he never wrote a formal philosophical treatise, his philosophical ideas are woven throughout his writing, and they had a profound impact on the founding of the United States, and they continue to influence us today.
And that, raises an important question for you, our listeners, to consider. Given how much Jefferson emphasized progress and the periodic renewal of, societal structures, how do you think he would view the philosophical and societal debates we're having today?
That's a great question.
How would this man who was so dedicated to reason and observation grapple with ideas that challenge his own beliefs, especially in areas where our understanding has advanced so much since his time?
Yeah, that's something to really think about.
It is. It's a question worth pondering.